Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Navigating Growth series, Expert Insights for SMEs. We're delighted you could join us today for our Hiring for Growth session. My name is Joanne Creevy, and I'll be your host for today's event. This is part of a limited five-part series we're running, where every month we'll tackle a new business challenge that matters to you. Whether it's funding, pricing, compliance, technology, or hiring, we're here to give you practical advice that you can use to grow your business. Each session is going to be a bit different, and today we're lucky to have Nell Marie Finlay, Head of Operations at Kenora, with us. Hi, Nell Marie,
Hi, Joanne.
who will be sharing her insights on hiring for growth. And the best part, this is Ask Me Anything session, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat or Q&A as we go, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end. So, Nell Marie, to kick us off, we have a submitted question. They're new to hiring. What are the steps to proceed hiring, job spec, contract, etc.?
Thank you, Joanne. Yes, I think what is important before going out to place a job ad, the more work you do before the interview process, the easier it is later in the recruitment process. So I think it's always important to have your job spec ready, have your contract ready, have your question bank ready. I find it very useful if you have a list of skills, attributes, things that you would like to measure predetermined before going out to market. You have that and your list of questions that you would like to ask during the interview process. It speeds your process up later, right? Later down the line. Now, once you have that ready, I think an important decision to make is how you are going to advertise. Are you going to use job boards? Do you potentially want to first give preference to internal staff to apply for the position? Are you going, and what job boards you would prefer? But also, are you going to use agencies? Now, agencies can get very pricey. There is definitely a place for them in particular roles that's very difficult, where there may be skill shortages in the market. Sometimes it's necessary to use agencies. And I think having an agency that you have a relationship with beforehand and you've built rapport with and you trust them before you decide to do it on your own, if you struggle to get the talent that you're looking for, you can go to the agencies. So that is very important. At this stage, I think it's also important once you're on those job boards to make sure that you set it in such a way to help you filter through candidates easier. Now, this can be with questions that you ask the candidates, not just to submit your resume or a letter or anything like that. You can say, okay, what are your must-haves? What do you want the candidates to have? Is it 3 years minimum experience? Is it that qualification? Is it this qualification? Now, a lot of the job boards would give you that option to say, if the person do not meet this qualification, they're automatically disqualified. And that really helps you to filter through all of the candidates. So setting those up in advance is really, really helpful. And then you can put your ad live, yourself, you can put that live. Now, what I find very useful is not to make the time from when you place the ad to the deadline of application too long. I think it's very important to do it short. What I would do is no longer than a week. At that point, you can pause the job and not run it continuously, assess the candidates, and if you're not satisfied, go out again and repost the ad. Or else if you wait for 2 weeks, you might be sitting with 500 applications to filter through. It makes it really difficult later down the line. So once you have your applicants who applied and that has been filtered through, I think the next step would obviously be to shortlist the candidates based on their resumes and CVs only. And what I find useful to do is I will say, I want my top 10. Let's look at the top 10 to start off with. Then you compare your top 10 with each other. Then you get your top 5. And from your top 5, you pick top 3. Now, that is just how we do it traditionally. I think having 3 interviews is a really good way to measure candidates against each other. And sometimes it's difficult to get the top 3. If it's a very specialized role, you may only get 3 applicants in that specific role. You may have to interview all 3. But I think if there's a high volume, that's usually my approach. Once you have that, that shortlist, the next process is obviously interviewing. Now, it's very important to interview candidates as close together to each other as possible. And whether you're interviewing in person or maybe using Teams or Zoom to interview, it's very useful to record interviews so that you are engaged in the interview process and not taking notes. If it's transcribed for you, you can also then share the interview afterwards with your team internally to give their second opinion. I always find it having two voices with people assessing different things throughout the interview is very useful. You know, you may have a colleague looking out for things like communication or skills in a particular technical area, and somebody else looking for culture fit, for example.
Yeah.
So recording these interviews, I think, is very useful. It's a useful tool. It transcribes it. It saves you time later down the line. You can always go back to it and rewatch it. So that's very useful. You know, if you're doing it in a remote setting, you know, if it is in
Yeah.
person, it is maybe useful to have someone just to take notes so that you can compare it later down the line. And then I think the final step is obviously once you've done the interviews and you've made your decision, is to go out and make an offer. It's always important when going out to make an offer to say, you know, it's contingent upon successful reference checks and things like that. But that way, you know, you can get immediately for them to say, okay, I'm accepting the offer, you can go to the next stage. Don't do the contracts before they accept that offer. You're just going to waste your time in doing that.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
think
I
I
think
did the
that
full cycle.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's really helpful, Neil Marie. But say for small businesses or startups that are hiring for the first time, would you
Yes.
recommend getting legal or HR advice before issuing a contract? I suppose after you've made that offer and they've accepted, as you say.
Yes, I think absolutely. That's a very good question, John. I think that is very important. I think, you know, an employment contract is a legal document.
Yeah,
And I think it's important to get their advice early on. They can provide you with a template where maybe you change just a couple of things like start date and salary. Make sure you get that template from a professional, somebody who understands what they're doing, someone who knows that this is what you have to include in an employment contract and what to exclude. I would even say with making the offer before the contract, if you want to ask for a second opinion on that, is
yeah,
maybe also a good idea. You know, am I saying anything in this offer email that is tying me in any way? So I would definitely recommend that, Joanne, to have that
yeah.
sense checked by somebody. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I suppose something that's really important to Kenora is their onboarding experience. What would you recommend? How early should you start planning for this in your view?
It's a very good question. I think you should almost see it as an extension of your
Yeah,
recruitment process, Joanne.
yeah,
Um, you know, once the person, even before the person starts, you know,
yeah,
laying out what their first couple of weeks may look like to that candidate is very important. So you're engaging with the candidate before they start. I think having a gap between interview and start date with no communication in between, you know, you lose that connection with the candidate between that time. And there have been, you know, we've seen instances if we are not engaging with candidates from interview to start date, they may still go out in market and try and find something else. So
yeah,
keeping those, I almost see it as prospecting,
yeah,
Joanne. Obviously, you can relate to that. You have to keep working with those
yeah,
candidates, you know, throughout that procedure. Now, what we've done that really works for us is a training plan in advance to say,
mm,
okay, this is what your first couple of weeks will look like. You send it to the candidate before they even start. Um, and then once they're in the first, I would even say up to the end of their probation, you
yeah,
need to stay engaged during that period. Monthly probation meetings, for example, check-ins, surveys,
mm,
things like that, making sure,
yeah,
because you invested a lot of time and money during the recruitment process. The success of that candidate is so important, and getting them in is not the final step. It carries on once they
yeah.
are over the line. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's really good insights, Nell Marie. And to follow on for that, from that, I suppose the first question, what is a reasonable profit margin and how to calculate this?
No, that is it depends on the industry, I would say, Joanne.
Yeah,
But if you have determined, and again, it is important to benchmark that, with within your industry to say, for example, if a good margin for your business is 50, for example, when you're hiring new people in, and I'm assuming the question relates to hiring people in and how do
yeah,
you maintain that margin, I think having a predetermined benchmark for your industry to say, my cost of sale or my cost of this service, if I include it in there, it should be around the 50% mark or 60 or whatever the benchmarked margin is. And I think if you get that right early on, it makes it easier for you to measure that and say, okay, I'm on the right track here, as you scale,
yeah,
and making sure that you keep an eye on that margin as you hire more and more people. There
yeah,
may be a period of investment, however, Joanne, because I think especially if you're starting out,
yeah,
it may not be perfect on the margin that you would like to see. There may be an investment period where you get people in and it may dip below your ideal margin.
yeah,
But set those things for yourself in advance and say, okay, I'm seeing this year, for example, as an investment year in my resources, but I would like to get to that ideal margin over X amount of months or years, etc.
yeah. You mentioned, Marie, about typical margins vary by industry. How can someone know if their pricing is sustainable when adding staff for the first time?
Well, I think, it's a very good question. I think, like I mentioned,
Mm,
knowing your industry and
yeah,
knowing what those benchmarks are,
yeah,
already gives you a lot of power. I
yeah,
think, knowing what good looks like,
yeah,
helps you to do that. Now, in saying that, as I mentioned before, I think especially when you're just starting out, it may not look like the ideal state
yeah,
when you're starting out. I think if you have that North Star of, "Ooh, if I can get there, that would be brilliant." But as we know, it takes some time to get to that ideal state. So there may be, like I said again, Joanne, there may be an investment period. And I think
yeah,
doing a lot of research in the beginning to say, what does good look like? And I think doing benchmarking on salaries in advance
yeah,
for your industry, if you're in the beauty industry, if you're whatever industry you're in, benchmark the salaries to say, if I am going out and I'm recruiting for this role, this is what the market is saying in terms of what I should be paying and how I'm going to be attractive as an employer in the market. So having those things in advance is definitely powerful to you when you're making decisions on hires and when to hire, etc.
That's really helpful, Marie. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do you balance the pressure to hire quickly when making sure it's the right fit for the team.
I
We
think
hear this a lot, don't we? Yeah.
we all battle with that. And I
Yeah.
think, I think sometimes our immediate reaction, we hear our team may be under pressure.
Mm,
Um, we need more resources. And I think, you feel rushed to put somebody in a seat.
yeah.
Um, but what is that saying about, go slow to go fast? I
Mm,
think you have to stop yourself
mm,
and make sure that you get the right people in.
yeah.
Getting somebody in very quickly, they may not work out, and then you're back to square one and you're wasting time.
Mhm,
So I do that all the time where I force myself to slow down
mm,
because you want to put somebody in place, make
mm,
sure that they can start working. I think some things that you can do, to make sure that it is as fast as possible, like I mentioned, be prepared in advance before you
mm,
hire. Have your templates ready, have your question banks ready, have your ideal candidate and the skills that they need ready. It will speed up the process as
mm.
you're trying to recruit. I would say don't speed up your decision, speed up your process. Try and automate as much as you can. And if you cannot automate, just make sure you have your templates ready. Make sure you have your agencies on standby. You have the job boards that you would like to post on. You have that ready. You have job specs done that you can reuse for future hires. Those things will speed it up. But don't speed up your decision for the sake of putting somebody in a seat if you're not comfortable with that. And I think we all battle with that. I think you want to put somebody in place, you want to take the pressure off your team, but it can bite you later
Yeah.
down the line if the person is not the right fit.
And would you say, Nell Marie, that, if you did need to fill, I suppose, a position or a role very quickly, I suppose, as a business is growing, would you recommend to go to an agency in this instant, or still follow, I suppose, the steps that you've put into place already with your hiring structure?
I think it depends from role to role and from business to business. You can
Mm,
do it simultaneously. Joanne, nothing stops you from going to agencies and going out on your own.
mm.
To say what comes first, right?
Yeah,
Spread the net as wide as you can, do your own efforts, also get some agencies, especially if you're worried about uh, roles that may be very difficult to fill in the market. I think immediately when you go out, maybe send it. Remember, you are not going to pay the agency if you don't take their candidate in most cases.
mhm.
So it can't hurt for you to go to an agency, establish a relationship and say, okay, can you get me candidates? I'm going to do my own efforts. And then you have more to choose from. So most of the agencies that we work with, you don't have to pay for their
Yeah,
efforts to recruit. So that can be helpful, I think, Joanne, just to get a wider variety
yeah,
of candidates from different areas.
yeah. Another great question that came in, Nell Marie. What are some red flags to look out for during the recruitment process, especially those that might not be obvious at first?
Yeah, I think those obvious ones. I think candidates that would try and move interviews on.
Yeah,
Sometimes legitimate things happen, and I think we're human. We have to be understanding during those times, especially if it's a very good candidate. But I think candidates who move interviews on, candidates who don't know your business or have done research about your business. I think that would be a red flag for me. So sometimes what we would do is we will put an employer question in on the job boards. And we would say, for example, pick one of our values and tell me why you would be a fit for the organization because of that value, and why does it align with your values?
mm,
Things like that to look out for, so that you're not just. Sometimes candidates will apply for multiple roles. As we know, it's normal. They will apply for multiple roles without really looking into the company, and they just click, 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 through it, and apply for as many as possible. I think making sure to look to see if the candidates actually have interest in you, in your company, know about your company, have done research about your company. Some of the other red flags during recruitment is if you ask questions to candidates, um, ask them to give examples during the interview process, to say, tell me about a time when you did XYZ. And they try and change direction from you. They try and avoid answering the question. To me, that is a red flag. If they're trying to talk about something else other than the question that you're answering, that you're asking, that can be a red flag as well. Now, unresponsive candidates as well, if you have to chase them heavily, either to interview, to set up an interview, or after you interview them and you are asking for references, for example, provide me with contactable references, which is another very important step, by the way, in
yeah,
recruitment, is making sure that you have. Now, we will say 2 to 3 contactable references. That is very important. So if that is strange to you,
mm,
now talking about references, if you get, for example, a reference where it's personal emails as opposed
mm,
to company emails, um, we have different tools now. I would, for example, look if the person that they're using as a reference is on LinkedIn, for example, and I'll see, okay, the role matches, the person is on
yeah,
LinkedIn, they are working for that company. That is very important, your references, and what references are they giving? Are they avoiding giving you references of previous managers, or is it
mm,
just people who used to work with them, etc.? Those things can be red flags. And I think during the interview itself, like I said, avoiding answering questions,
yeah,
um, not asking enough questions at the end when you ask them to ask
yeah,
questions. Are they asking questions just about what the company can do for them? For example, are you very flexible? And that's good to ask those questions because you want to make
yeah,
sure it's a good match, right, for
yeah,
yourself. But if they're not asking any questions about the role, what does good look like in this role? Are they
mm,
curious about the role itself, or just curious about what's in it for them at
yeah.
the end of it? That would be something that I would look out for during an interview process.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And often in the past, I found that even sending a task to the person to prepare really shows how interested and how much they understand the company and the role as well. So it can really identify
Yes.
if they're the right fit for the company and the role and culture fit, as you would say.
Yes. Yeah, I think the tasks that you can set, I wouldn't do that with every single role,
Yeah,
Joanne, but I think especially if it is a specialized role, you
yeah,
know, maybe second interview,
hmm,
it's important to send them some kind of, whether it's a technical test, whether it's a
yeah,
task, whether it's whatever you want to do. And I think especially if you're struggling to choose between different
yeah,
candidates or not sure in your
yeah,
decision, right?
yeah,
And I think that is where it becomes really useful to have more than one panelist, even if they're not interviewing with you, but
mhm,
watching your interview and giving you their perspective, right? I think is very important. Something that we've implemented, for example, was having like a score rubric that we implemented where two people will either interview or watch the interview, and independently they will put a score on specific things for the candidates. So they will say, in terms of communication, it's a 4 out of 5. And that person may say 1 out of 5. And
yeah,
it's very interesting to then come back, calibrate, compare notes, and then have a good discussion around deciding on candidates, because you sometimes don't observe something that someone else
yeah. It's
observed.
definitely good to have someone else there supporting you with the recruitment process anyway, for sure. Yeah. Now, Marie, someone has asked about aligning hiring decisions with long-term business goals. Like, how do you make sure your hiring strategy fits both the current needs and the future direction of the company?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Joanne. I think when we go out to hire for a particular role, um, it's natural for us to look for a placement for that role. This person needs
Mm,
to be able to do payroll. Let's just get someone who can do payroll. Now, a useful tool that you can implement is to say, what are the skills you need today as a business
mm,
in order to tick over every single month? You know, it may just be, okay, this person needs to do payroll, but what are those future critical skills when your business grows? What are those skills that you would like to bring into the business, that you would like to hire into the business that's maybe not present in your business? And using one or two of those critical skills for future as part of your scoring rubric, to say, okay, I am going to ask this person around their abilities around project management, and it may not be needed today in your business, but it's maybe something you need in future. So I think that way you are building those future skills that's needed in your business, even though you don't need them today. So having an eye on that always is important, you know, and there are
yeah.
small things that you can do to make sure that you are ready for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We often see businesses focus so much on filling today's gap and forget what we might need the role to do or evolve into in the future. So that's really good. Here's another relevant one. Should businesses be investing in culture even when they're just starting to scale, or do you think that comes a little later?
It's such a good question. And I always say it's never too early to invest in culture.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you know, your first hires, I think subsequent hires tend to mirror the hires who came in the beginning. And if you don't hire the right culture fit in the beginning, your new recruits will mirror the person who was
Mhm.
there first. So I would say absolutely. I would say it is even more critical in the beginning stages. Because if you do that wrong in the beginning, it may become a big ship to try and turn around if you're trying to do a culture change. That is very difficult to do, to change a culture that's well established. Um, so to answer the question, it's never too early to invest in that. And I think articulating that for yourself and putting it down and saying, what are the culture you would like to build in your business? And how can you assess through it's very difficult to have to frame these questions to assess culture fit, right? But I think writing it out for yourself and then framing some questions through the interview process to assess not just culture fit but culture add. What would you like to add as part of the culture? And using that as well to assess candidates, not just, okay, they can do payroll, they're local, they can do this, but also look at those things, you know, the things that you would like to add into your business as a culture. I think especially in the beginning,
Yeah.
as you start to grow.
Yeah,
Yes,
so you recommend early investment in culture can
yes.
definitely prevent, I suppose, growing pains later. Is there anything you recommend to implement to businesses that are maybe early stages or just scaling or just, I suppose, growing their team a little bit? Is there anything that you would recommend to sort of boost culture within a company?
Well, I think the people make the culture, Joanne, and that's
Yeah.
ultimate. And that is why your recruitment process is so important. And
Mm,
articulating for yourself, if you can't articulate what your culture is,
yeah.
how do you expect, you know, candidates who know nothing about your business to know what you're looking
Mm,
for? And it is about the people that you're hiring. Yes, the company has an obligation
mm,
to make sure that they foster that culture
mhm,
throughout, but it is very important to get the right people in.
mhm.
They are going to work with each other on a day-to-day basis. They're going to influence each other. It creates the culture of your business. You cannot be involved in every single conversation in your business.
Yeah.
So yes, that would be
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, that's great, Nell Marie. And finally, in today's competitive hire environment, how do you ensure your team is fully qualified and ready for the roles? Nelmy, could you share some of the strategies you've used to maintain high standards during recruitment?
Yeah, I think this is particularly relevant to those roles difficult to fill, those very
Yeah,
technical roles, Joanne. So we touched on it previously. I think having technical tests that you send these candidates throughout the hiring process is important. You
mhm,
know, if you can have some kind of test that you want to run them through, I think that is very important. Again, the panel of interviewers is very important in this sense, because if you have just your HR person interviewing somebody, not assessing technical ability, bringing a technical expert in, asking them those technical questions to assess that, I think that helps you to make sure that you're getting the technical ability and maintain those standards of hiring. Doing testing, doing the correct, the correct questions, throughout the process, and not just assessing technical ability, assessing the soft skills, assessing the culture fit. I think if you are committed to that and not steer away from that just to save time, I think you can't go wrong. And again, reference checking is very, very important. Make
mhm.
sure to look out for that. Make sure to really ask the references good questions about technical ability and why would you say this person has the technical ability that we need in the business. So all of these resources are very important to you. I also use LinkedIn to look at candidates, for example, to say if they're saying they're strong in a particular skill, I do a secondary check in that. So there are various things that you can do to assess technical ability through tests, through the interview process itself, through reference checking, and that can be very useful to make sure you get the right skill.
And Nelmy, on references, would you recommend to get more than one? I suppose to make sure that they align and match to what the person's criteria is and strengths, maybe and maybe weaknesses.
Oh, absolutely. I think at least two
At least two,
contactable.
okay.
I
Yeah,
wouldn't just say one. I would say
yeah,
at least two. Now, sometimes people just have one previous employer, and that's understandable. I would ask for a secondary, perhaps from their college, university. Do they want to give
yeah.
a lecture? So I would ask those questions. I think two contactable to me would be the minimum to compare.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I suppose to conclude, um, could you just summarize, I suppose, some key, maybe 5 tips for, I suppose, hiring in this challenging market at the moment, um, that you would sort of recommend?
think I think my message would be to automate or make things easier for yourself in
Hmm.
the recruitment process so you don't waste time in
Hmm.
that. In the things that don't add value, don't waste time on it. Have
Hmm.
your templates ready, know where you're going to advertise so that those things are not part of your decision making process. Your decision um, uh, energy should be based on the candidate that you're choosing and not what template I'm going to use and what question I'm going
Yeah,
to ask. So have that in advance. That can be very, very helpful. Um, I think don't rush the
yeah.
decision. It is going to add um, to your frustration later down the line where you're going to have to go back out into the market and recruit. So take your time in making the right hires, because that is very, very important. You said 5, Joanne. How many did I give?
Yeah, I think you've summarized quite a bit, and we're just out of time there anyway. So I suppose if there is any follow-up questions for Nell Marie, feel free to reach out to hello@kenora.com. But thanks so much for everyone joining today and for your participation, and of course Nell Marie for your expert insights for hiring growth. So I hope you found the new ideas that you can put into action to your business. And do reach out, as I say, if you have any questions. So thanks so much for being with us today, and keep an eye out on our resources page for upcoming webinars as well. As mentioned, we have a new topic every month. Thank you. Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Bye bye.